All right. Hello. Welcome to the ASP.NET Community Stand-Up. I'm John Galloway. I'm a PM on the .NET community team, and today we're joined by Sourabh Shirhatti. And so you work on a lot of cool stuff, but I think some of the stuff we've talked to you recently about is very like it's server oriented. And can you describe your?
Right. Yeah. So one of the things that I work on now is diagnostics and observability of the .NET platform all up. So irregardless of the application model you use, you're probably interested in figuring out what's happening, what's going wrong. Maybe you're curious in like performance insights, why something is taking so long. So generally, that encompasses diagnostics and observability. And we've been in the .NET space, we've been working all the way from like logs and metrics that everyone uses to deep diagnostics and dump analysis. So there's a lot of good stuff happening in that area. But today I kind of wanted to hop on the show, obviously hang out with you, John, and talk about distributed tracing.
Awesome. And just, I think suspense is good. And you were talking to me before the call. You've got a very cool webcam going that you said's blue screened your computer a few times recently. So so that could be like, just if anyone loves suspenseful TV shows, this could be that.
So fingers crossed. Let's see what happens.
We'll see how it goes. Okay, I will jump right into the community links. Got some fun, interesting ones today. As always, I share these at the end. Actually, I'll throw them in the so you can follow along. Community links. And we'll see if I can type. There we go. So I threw those out in the chat. All right, so here we go. First of all, one really exciting one. James just posted about this last week. So this is the .NET Live TV, and what's really cool with this is we started with the ASP.NET community stand-up like back when .NET Core was still being kind of designed. And since then, over time, James and I worked together and we started the Thursday shows up, and those include like desktop tooling, all kinds of like mobile, all the different kind of areas. And then since then, we've had it on Wednesday shows. And so we have EF and machine learning. And so especially this year with everyone, working from home and we felt like these shows are really important. So we built out, and James ran this. It's amazing. So this is this whole .NET Live TV. So it includes not just the community stand-ups, but it also includes things like Jeff Fritz doing the C#. There's this C# corner with InstaFluff. There's the .NET Docs show. So this is kind of your one place for watching all the shows. So this is neat. One thing I want to call out here that's really cool. We've got the Blazor Focus show starting up soon. So Safia Abdullah is going to be running that. And so this is where you can find all the stuff. So really excited about this. And this site is built using Blazor, which is really neat. So I've been able to like watch as James and the Blazor team's doing code reviews and helping get it all set up and everything. So it's really it's a cool site, and I'm really excited about it.
I hear you had an interesting outage on the new site last week. Do you have a story about that?
No, actually, well, I mean, it's been up and down. Oh yeah, that was certs, right? There was a key cert rotation issue. Yeah. So there's that. There's been all kinds of interesting things I've been learning as far as how they do loading, and some of the things were originally like this. Some of the site was originally, the code that we wrote was Razor Pages, and then they did Blazor Server, and now it's Blazor WebAssembly. And so it's really pretty cutting edge stuff, how they're doing it. So yeah. Okay, this is an interesting one I saw come across. This is from Alex, and he's writing about, he's asking some interesting questions. So he's saying, why are web apps, here he wants to, look at, buying something on Amazon, and it takes like several seconds to load, and there's a ton of data being sent over the wire and stuff. And then he compares that to, something like Doom. And, he says, like, what's the frames per second that we get in, when you're just like running a Doom app or, running a game? Why are these web applications so slow? So he actually does somewhere towards the beginning, I'm missing it here, but he does talk about the, like, why are they not that quick. And he's got an interesting system that he's written up here, and it's dependency tracking for everything in the page. And he actually uses Blazor on the front end, and he's using WebSockets, and he's actually got this library called Fusion. And so it's doing this. Actually, it's not just tied to Blazor. He's got a sample using Blazor, but he's got a lot of different ones. But the idea here is where he's doing change tracking and allowing for very rapid updates based on tracking just the things that need to be updated. So instead of, like, if you look at something like one of these page loads, you're reloading tons of stuff and you're sending tons of information over the wire. And what he's building is examples that are just doing very tight change tracking. So it's very interesting. He's got a lot of interesting samples that you can dig into in his repos. So I'd love to hear comments on this, how people are, if people could look into this and see what they think. I think there's some very interesting ideas there. All right, here's an interesting one from Madhu, and he's looking at, can I write a Blazor component with no HTML and no events? And so basically just write a class. And it's kind of a just, did you know you could do this sort of thing? So here he's creating a class, inheriting from iComponent, and then he's got some handlers. So for instance, he's got a render delegate, and he's got set parameters async, and he's got this iComponent attach. And using that, this is a simple self-contained class that renders, in this case, this component. So, he's a lot of it is just interesting to see how it's wired up and how the kind of Blazor internals work. I do think this could be interesting for distributing classes and stuff. It's just a very, tight single C# file. So neat stuff. All right, Brian Laguna is writing about using NPM packages in Blazor. So there's a lot of great libraries out there, JavaScript libraries that are available in NPM. And, especially at this point in where we're at with Blazor, Blazor itself being relatively new, and there's not always a one-to-one mapping of everything you want that's available as a Blazor component. There's more stuff out there in NPM. So he's showing how to set that up. So he does a walkthrough. He shows, setting up NPM directly in your app, doing installing, and then like with Webpack CLI as a developer dependency, setting up the build script for it, and then integrating it into your Blazor application. And then here he shows, NPM build run, and you can set up your CS proj to actually run those NPM tasks. So there's definitely different ways to do this. I've seen also people just taking JavaScript and wrapping that using the Blazor, using Blazor interop and creating a light wrapper component. But this is interesting to see the full kind of walkthrough using NPM. All right, Andrew Locke, again with an amazing series. So we've been showing a few of these. Here he's showing on running with Kubernetes. And here he's looking specifically at running database migration. So he's actually got two here. He's got one on running when deploying, and then this specific one is on using jobs and init containers. And so here he talks through how he's running this. And this is always, database migrations are tricky, and there's different ways to do it. A lot of the time I've heard from different teams, some are it's only, that's something that the DBAs run, and, we don't do anything with that, or because it can be a little tricky how you handle it. But so here's the example using that, setting that up, using the init containers. He talks through some of the different options. You can use EF core migrations from Global Tool. You can execute them manually, calling database migrate. You can use some great libraries out there, or using some sort of different tool. So here he's got a console application and he's showing using a migrator doing that. So, a nice kind of walkthrough setting that up. Curious in the chat as well if you've got a system that you use for doing migrations. So, And then, of course, he ends. I love how his posts end up. He always, gives his link to a source, and then he talks about, he sums it up and talks about how he's got that set up and using a Helm chart installation. So this is just something that applies for everybody. This is really cool. This is code navigation for C# repositories in GitHub. So this was just announced yesterday. So now as you are browsing your C# repositories, you actually get this nice semantic code navigation. I want to shout out specifically a lot of people, but I know Damien Gard put a ton of work on this. This goes back to, this issue was opened June 2019, and it's taken a lot of work updating these tree sitters and everything. So they were called out in the announcement post here on GitHub, but I just a big thank you to the folks that set that up. That's going to make .NET coding easier.
That's definitely been a godsend in terms of productivity.
Yep, exactly. Being able directly in the GitHub interface to be able to search through. So yeah. Cool. This is a cool one from Shahed. So he's writing about debugging multiple .NET Core projects in VS Code. So he answered this question from an individual, so might as well just write it up as a blog post. And so he shows how to set up a launch configuration, his launch JSON. This is, again, like, regularly you'll have like a front end app and a back end API, or maybe a few different APIs. And so running and debugging those all can be a pain. And so this is nice to just set up a launch configuration. And then also this is nice with the launch panel and being able to have with the terminal, you can have multiple terminals as well. So that's nice to be able to do that. So that's that. All right, Christos. So this is something that they've been coding up on their 425 show. They were on our show, about a month ago now, and talking about integrating with, in that case, they were doing Microsoft.identity.web. So here they're showing accessing Microsoft Graph from gRPC using Azure AD. So there's a lot here. He talks about benefits of gRPC, talks about all the integration. A lot of screenshots here, of course, because we've got to go through and set up the Azure AD integration. So he does all the app registration stuff. And updating gRPC service, etc. But then once you're done and you're running it, it's wonderful. You do the Azure AD authentication, it works, everyone's happy. So he shares out the code, and then if you want to see more about it, you can interact directly with them on Tuesday mornings. They have this 425 show. All right, YARP. So this is cool. YARP just released 1.0 Preview 6, and some neat things here. There's support for HTTP helper for query transforms, header-based routing, which I understand was an important user request, and so cool to see as they continue rolling this out. And they have support for 5.0 RC2, so that's good stuff. Okay, here's another Blazor one. This is Neil Swinberger, and he's talking about real-time application with Blazor Server and Firestore. So I actually have two clustered together here. Firestore is Google technology on Google Cloud Platform, and he's showing integrating that. So there's Firebase and Firestore, and he does the walkthrough creating the application, creating the Firestore backend, integrating that in with a .NET Console application. And then we also see later integrating with the real-time UI with Blazor Server and Firestore. So this is cool. So it's neat because Blazor is, it's web technologies. It's all open standards and all that can integrate with whatever backend. So cool to see that. And then so there's Google, and here's a cool one from AWS. And so AWS has this open source porting assistant for .NET. So this is .NET in general, updating any .NET framework to .NET Core. They'd previously announced this in July, And what they are announcing here is that it's open source. They're open sourcing it. So this is cool. This is something that'll analyze .NET Framework .NET Framework applications and help you understand what you'll need to do in order to move to .NET Core, as well as give some recommendations. So for instance, he gives an example here of configuring a recommendation for like system data SQL client, and talking about, here's what your recommended update will be, add a reference to this. So these are all these rules. They have pre-configured ones, and you can extend them as well. So you can extend using these JSON things. You can also, they have support for Roslyn analyzers. And so he talks about there's this, here he's talking about in the CodeLyzer repository and using Roslyn-based code analyzer for that. So this looks like a really, helpful utility as you're analyzing your applications. There's of course other things. There's the porting assistant, and there's things in the docs where we make recommendations. But this is a really nice kind of automated thing that you can point at your source code. So, all right, just a couple more. So this is actually this is the last one, because this one here is a dupe. So this is a neat one. This is a community roadmap. There's been a lot of, this has been, built up over, there's been years of contributions on this. And this is neat. This is a ASP.NET Core developer in 2021. So looking ahead, here's kind of a map of things to learn. So, talking about the general development skills, C#, solid, ASP.NET basics, and then getting into more advanced things. So like task scheduling or microservices. And this is up to date, including things like Dapper and Thai. So that's kind of the map up at the top, and then links to all these different places where you can learn about it. So this is always cool to see the community building these sorts of things out. So wow, a lot of good stuff. As always, I'm always thinking like, oh, do we have any links today? And then I'm frantically cutting them out because there's just too much goodness. So that is all my links I've got today. All right. So what do you got for us, Sourabh?
So I wanted to talk about, before I get into demos and show you what we have, sort of give some historical basis of how we landed up here, right? So we've had this library in .NET called System Diagnostics Diagnostic Source. Specifically, there was a type of interest called activity. And activity was basically the primitive used for, tracking distributed tracing information. And I think back in, was it 3.1? We did some work where, if you, in the context of an ASP.NET application, we created a new activity for every incoming request. And then on outbound requests, we sort of propagated this information, and, we used known HTTP headers. And so on the other side, if you had another ASP.NET application, it would understand the distributed tracing information we sent over the wire, it would interpret it, and ergo you could, propagate this information from app to app. And what we had done is we invented this hierarchical format. And the way we did it was we looked internally, we saw what a couple of teams in Azure were doing, and we thought, hey, this is a good way to represent it. At the same time, in the community, there were a couple of projects. There was Open Tracing and Open Census, and they sort of merged together to form this new project called OpenTelemetry. And OpenTelemetry is now part of the CNCF. For folks who are not familiar, that's the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which is part of the Linux Foundation, right? And what they're trying to do is they are trying to now define a vendor-neutral specification for publishing and capturing observability data. And when I say observability data, there's sort of this consensus in the industry that there are three pillars of observability. So we have tracing, which is distributed tracing, logging, and metrics. So OpenTelemetry is trying to grow into the role to solve all those needs. But the focus of the project primarily, at least thus far, has been on distributed tracing. So while we're looking at investments, especially in the .NET 6 timeframe, to align the metric story in .NET with OpenTelemetry, today let's focus on the distributed tracing aspect of it.
Sounds good.
let me go ahead and pull up this link. I'm always worried when we're on this stream because one of the tabs is our StreamYard. I'm
I
scared of closing
know.
it.
Yeah.
Can you see my screen, John?
It's up there now.
Okay, so this is first thing I want to point folks to. There's this, like I mentioned, right? OpenTelemetry aims to define a vendor neutral specification. So this repository sort of has the specification. So this is language agnostic specification, and then it's really up to the OpenTelemetry implementations in each of the language stacks to implement the specification. So what we did in .NET is when we spoke to customers, the thing that we found out is uh, folks are wary of taking uh, external dependencies when they're building libraries. Like it's a little different if you're an end user, right? But as a library, we've all, we know the horrors of binding redirects of paths and conflicting versions of transitive dependencies. So what we said is, hey, if this specification is stable, let's make sure the primitives that exist in .NET can capture the same fidelity of information, or at least everything that we think makes sense. So the OpenTelemetry, so there's a project called OpenTelemetry.net, which understandably, you can guess from the name, is the .NET implementation of the OpenTelemetry project. And this is supported on, .NET 4, 5 and above, and .NET Core, all the supported versions of .NET Core. So it's, it's pretty widely applicable. And what we said, and I won't read through the entire document, but the basic guidance is rather than directly relying on the OpenTelemetry APIs, you don't if you're a library author, you don't need to take a dependency on this. You can just use like types in system diagnostic source, which is actually part of the BCL. It also ships as a new package for framework, and you can create these types. And now because we have the same projection of data that OpenTelemetry spans do, when you integrate your project with OpenTelemetry, like if you add in their exporter APIs, for example, you use OpenTelemetry to export this data to Zipkin, and if that doesn't make any sense, no worries, I'll cover it in a demo very soon. You get that information without having taken a dependency on OpenTelemetry to synthesize the data. So they're really, the biggest call to action I have today is if you're a library author, now is a seriously good time to look at adding support for OpenTelemetry, right? So let's do this. Let me hop over into Visual Studio and I'll show I'll show a simple demo and then we'll go from there, right? So, sorry, John, did you say something?
No, just sounds good.
Okay.
Yep.
So we have this, like I mentioned, we have this new activity API, and what we've done is we've sort of made it as part of the work to make it more compatible with OpenTelemetry. We also made it a more ergonomic and easy to use API. So now if you were a library author, this is sort of the pattern you'd be using to create an activity. So I have an activity source here. It's a named activity source. And whenever I have my operation of interest, I can use the activity source to start a new activity. And it handles certain things for me, like it makes sure, like you obviously don't want to create an activity if no one's listening, right? Or based on the sampling policy, this activity might not be observed. You might only observe 10% of all traces going through the system. So it sort of is smart there and helps you save on things. But once you're in the context, in this context, and you have an activity created, you can do stuff like annotated with information. You obviously have tags are a set of key value pairs, events are certain operation with timestamps, and then there are certain other key value pairs you can add, like status is something that's defined as part of the OpenTelemetry span specification, something we don't quite have in .NET yet, but you can use, I think there's some, what's the word I was looking for, semantic guidance on use a well-known tag. I'm actually trying to look at it here,
Yeah.
but I would say, this would be a good link for folks to check out. It's on the OpenTelemetry side, and this is the guidance. So yeah, for things that aren't necessarily supported, you can set, well-known tags and things like that. So anyway, now that I've created the activity, there are two ways to consume it, right? You could create an activity listener directly, and that's sort of the raw, BCL type. Or what you would most likely be doing is you'd be using OpenTelemetry, right? And what I've done here is I have configured a tracer provider, and in this case, I've added a console exporter. So this is, again, this is a simple demo, but in a more real world application, you might add a Zipkin exporter, and you'd probably add this Zipkin exporter to both your front end, back end, or whatever, all the tiers of your service, so it can stitch together the information. So if I go ahead and run this, there shouldn't be anything interesting right now, but I just want to show this. So this is sort of information that we've annotated on the activity. There's a couple of other things like the start time and the duration that it creates for us. And remember, we're talking about events. Like I added an event of my own, and it gave me like a timestamp. So I happen to see there like a couple questions pouring in about the exporters and Zipkin, and I promise you folks I will get to it. So now that I've done this, so I was talking about what library authors have to do, right? They have to do something like this. Now, obviously, we would be amiss if we didn't do it in our own libraries. So what we've done is in ASP.NET Core and in HTTP client, we've already done this for you. Right. So now, even if you're speaking from like a Python application to a .NET Core application, if the Python application is instrumented with OpenTelemetry, and then it uses the W3C trace context, so that's a recently ratified W3C standard that tells you how to propagate this information using HTTP headers, right?
Which is really cool, because then like you're saying, it's W3C standard, and this includes front end, back end, microservices, all that stuff. So instead of poking around and saying like, is the problem here, is the problem here, you can get this kind of complete view.
Yeah, and so that's our goal. We've been working very closely on this effort with the team that owns Azure Application Insights, and I think the desire for a vendor neutral specification is great, and especially one that works across all languages. So it's something the thing that I'm showing you is something where Application Insights will get to it. We'll get to the point where it can be OpenTelemetry based, but it's not just for .NET. It's going to achieve that for all languages.
Now, one place that I've seen Zipkin recently is when I've been going through the Project Tie things, and that has integration with Zipkin or there's an extension. I forget what it's called. Right. It's like a plugin or extension for that. So that's nice to see that kind of. Is there any kind of overlap between what they're doing with Project Tie and this work with OpenTelemetry?
Right. It's funny you ask that question, because I was doing something unrelated, but I happen to have this window open right here. So I think in a earlier talk when I was here, I came and spoke about event pipe and the diagnostic server. So one of the things is, in addition to I was talking about the raw BCL API activity listener that you could use to get this information. We also have a way of egressing this information from out of the process, so you don't have to be present within the process to get to it. So I have this .NET trace command. I can try and zoom in, and the provider of interest is the Microsoft Diagnostics diagnostic source. And you can say, hey, I want to listen to certain events. I apologize because this is extremely confusing, but we had to define a DSL and stick it into a string to turn on what provider. So in here, I've only enabled the start of this the start provider, and I get the span ID. So Tie Tie injects some stuff in your application, the way it actually gets distributed tracing information is effectively using this. They'll subscribe to a couple more events and a couple more providers, but they are using the activity information, and that's how. And then Tie populates it in its own process and then sends it to Zipkin, which you can use to visualize.
Okay.
Right. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to show you a demo. I'm running it with Tie, but that just happens to be incidental. But I'm going to be using Zipkin directly from my application. So I'm not really relying on the, the Tie I'm not relying on type per se. So oh, sorry, just one thing before I jump over. I want to say, yes, while you can use Activity Listener to directly consume this information, you're more likely going to be using something like OpenTelemetry. And then OpenTelemetry has the notion of exporters. So it's sort of the same core library, very similar to like our iLogger syncs, right? You can plug in different logger providers and you get the same fidelity of information going out to different syncs. So I was showing you in this example, I had a console exporter that I just ran and I could have added Zipkin. But I'm going to hop over now to this ASP.NET application I have. And what I've done here is I've set up distributed tracing. So I had to do a couple of things. I'm in my startup.configure services, and I said, hey, let's add OpenTelemetry. And I told you, right, ASP.NET Core has already been instrumented with activity, and so has HTTP client. But these sort of extension methods tell you, hey, let's start listening to the information created by this stuff. All right.
So I don't know if now's a good time, but this is an interesting question from Alfred. He's asking for the difference between tracing in this context versus that's in Microsoft Extensions logging when using trace log level.
Okay, so so the trace log level just happens to, the word trace happens to be overloaded, and the trace log level when we're talking about logging is just one of the different levels of verbosity, right? This isn't that. So when I'm talking about distributed tracing here, I'm really talking about how do I see the causal links between relationships. I promise you it will make more sense if you bear with me for just another minute or so.
I mean, the whole thing comes down to it's distributed, right? So in a distributed application, you're trying to understand, I've got a back end, I've got a data tier, I've got an API, I've got this, I've got the front end, API, maybe multiple front ends. And how do I understand what failed? Why did this order come in and not get or why is it slow or whatever, right?
But there's also the interesting bit, which is you might want to see like this Gantt chart or waterfall of these causally related operations. But most likely, once you see that, you're going to probably want to go back to your logs. And I'm going to get to that in a bit too. As part of the distributed tracing work, we also made we made logging distributed tracing aware. So I'll get to that. So I have this, the application I was showing you is this trivia game that's been built. So there's a front end and a back end. It's a Blazor front end talking to gRPC back end. And sort of I had to do this in both my applications. I said, hey, let me add distributed tracing. And in this case, I say, let me add, ASP.NET Core instrumentation, HTTP client. I have an always-on sampler here, but there's sort of, different sampling strategies, like I mentioned. You can only sample some of the stuff going in. And then I sort of just got my connection string and I'm sending my data here. So now for the fun bit, which is, let me pull over a tab. Okay, so this is the application I've written. So let's go to this bit where I play trivia. I'm going to play as John.
All right.
My score doesn't count. Now, what this did is actually it started a streaming gRPC call. So the service actually streaming me questions. If I go ahead and say answer this question, the server streams me another question right away.
Nice.
And let me go ahead and answer another question. It was a simple game, 2 questions. You did really well, John. You scored 100% on the quiz. And I can go ahead and play again, but I'm going to go ahead and close this for now. And so, I told you all these things. There's a front end, back end, which effectively there are a bunch of operations that are causally related, right? And I would love to see that relationship. So how would I do that? So because I've been sending this information to Zipkin, and now hopefully a lot of the folks I've frustrated by not getting to Zipkin up until now will be happy. I can go in here. So I had Zipkin running locally. And you see
Zipkin's really cool. Like when I first, that was my first look at it, was going through the Blazor tutorial, the TIE tutorials, and seeing this visualization is beautiful. Like it's useful too, but it looks cool.
No, absolutely. And so, I was telling you all these things, like this was the beginning of the Blazor circuit. And, I did this start trivia. It was a gRPC call. You can see this information came from gRPC. I even have the OpenTelemetry status code reported by the gRPC library because it's aware. And then this was my, I said there was a streaming call. So you can see there's this 17-second long call. Excuse me. And then you see at the end, at the completion of that, I sent another call to get my score. And you can see, this is sort of, these were small, so you might have missed it at first, but this is like a time series view of this, right?
Okay.
And this stuff is super cool, but I'm now going to jump back over to my code and show you something else. So now bear with me for a couple of seconds. I'm going to take a small detour and go back and talk about logging, right? So
Okay.
let's do this. Yeah, so
so the tracing at that level wasn't showing specific log stuff. It's showing the timing. It's a time.
Right. So
like
it has the
sequence.
yes. So there are like certain properties associated with it. One is like start stop. You can add like tags to it, which is basically like key value pairs of information. You can also have activity links. Like I showed you a simple thing where one thing called another, which called another. Sometimes you can have like batched operations. You can fire 10 off together. So you can have links that say, hey, this is my peer rather than this is my parent. So all of that could be visualized using that. Sort of think of the in Chrome you have that thing where you see the order of HTTP operations. It was, where's that gone?
Like the network activity.
Yeah, exactly. This one, right? And you see this waterfall. It's something like that's a very similar visualization too. But so I'm taking a small detour to talk about logging, and it will make sense in a second, right?
Yeah.
So I just want to remind folks. So this is simple. I'm using logging in a console application, and I've done this thing called logger.begin scope, and we've had we use an async local to persist scope information. So even if you go async to perform other operation, this remains. And what this effectively does is says, hey, all these log messages that happen inside this logging scope, please annotate this information, right? So if I go ahead and run this sample, that took longer than I thought. Okay, so these are the logs that I expect, like, hey, log information. So you see info, you see the stuff, but then you see this information annotated for each of these logs because we're running inside the context of a logging scope, right? And so this, because this mechanism exists in logging, we said, hey, why don't we make the log smarter and we make it activity aware? So I'm going to hop into this example now. And you might have deduced what I'm getting at, which is if we have this way to just stick arbitrary baggage on logs, why don't we stick what activity you're running under right now? So we added a couple of options on the logger. So you say, now when I'm creating, configuring logging, I say activity tracking options. And I said, hey, annotate each of my logs with the span ID, trace ID, and parent ID.
Okay.
Right? So trace ID is, for the current operation, parent is who invoked me, and span is that logical identifier that goes, across the entire trace.
Okay.
Right? And once I did this, so the other thing I have to do is I have to actually be running in the context of an activity for this to, yield anything useful. But in this case, I am. So I created an activity. So now I'm running inside the context of an activity. So now if I go ahead and run this, you can see, so I still have the same, scope information from last time, right? This one, but also you see this new stuff added. I have my span ID, trace ID, and parent ID. Now, we would be amiss if we didn't put 2 and 2 together and realize we could offer you something that works right out of the box.
Yeah. Yep.
So what I did, so you don't have to do this, by the way. If you're running an ASP.NET Core, this stuff happens for you directly. But if you're running in, in another context, or newing up your logger, and you want to be distributed tracing aware, you might have to do this. So if I go back over to this tab, right? So you see, we were looking at this, operation. So you see, there's this trace ID associated with this operation, and I'm going to go ahead and copy this. And now I'm going to go to where my logs live right now. And so, I just happen to be using Tide to run it, but whatever your eventual log store is. And I'm just going to do a naive, search and page and stick in that trace ID, and boom. And this is sort of the workflow you would be using, right? You'd be like,
Yeah.
hey, I go look at this, distributed trace and something seems amiss. Let me use this as the way to key into my logs and identify what went wrong.
Mm-hmm.
And all of this, just works. You don't have to do like anything for the logs to be activity aware.
Okay. Just by setting those things, then it's added into your logs as well.
Right.
So cool.
So yeah,
wow.
Go ahead, John.
So there's a question here, and I've seen Zipkin. I haven't seen Jagger. So there's a few people asking how this compares to Jagger.
So I personally have not used Jaeger.
Okay.
I mean, I wouldn't be the best person to comment.
Okay.
However, I do want to point out that it's all you need is a different exporter for OpenTelemetry. Like the code you write should not change, and that's the goal of this project.
So you just write to the standard, the OpenTelemetry standard, and then anything in that ecosystem can
go back in here. So there are a couple of things. When you set up OpenTelemetry, you say, what all instrumentation types do I want? Right. So in this case, I said I want ASP.NET Core, I want HTTP client. There was the other one in which I think I said, hey, I want gRPC as well, right? Then you say, what is the sampling? So how many of these samples do you want to consume? And there are different philosophies you can have. And then the last bit is you add the exporters. You're like, where do you want to send this information?
Okay.
Right. And I added Zipkin. I believe there's a Jaeger exporter, and if there isn't, I trust there'll be one very, very soon. And we're looking at adding an application insights exporter. I know a couple of the other APM vendors have it. I think I don't remember which ones. I think maybe was it Splunk and I want to say Datadog have exporters. And this is sort of the move across the industry. Everyone's moving to this.
Okay, here's a relatively big question here. I'm not sure.
Okay.
Do you see this on the screen here?
Yeah. So they say teams historically have used the GUID.
And that the link that * is ASP.NET. It stars out links.
Oh, I see. Got it.
Yeah. So they want to map incoming GUID header as a parent trace ID.
So I don't know that the ASP.NET layer is pluggable enough. However, you could sort of, I think, I don't think you can change the ASP.NET behavior. However, what you can do is you can create a new activity, like new up your own activity context, and you can instantiate that activity context using that incoming header.
Okay. So you'd be able to map it to that. Then.
The format, though, like the GUID is not compatible with the OpenTelemetry specification, right? Like, so there might be some.
What would be better is to instead of doing your own custom GUID in a header, to actually just use the W3C, like to use the standard stuff, right?
Right. I'm not sure how they're using the GUID. If the GUID is just like to correlate their logs, they could very much just add tags. Like, in my example, where'd this go? Give me 1 second. I'll hop back over here. You see, I added this tag with the server name.
Right. So you can
just add a tag. So it's hard to say based on how you're using it, but the expectation is the solution should be complete and it should be usable.
Okay, so I could put multiple tags based on whatever I'm.
Yep.
Okay. Cool. All right.
And so I can, the one thing I want to talk to is about the project and what the maturity level is. So right now, the OpenTelemetry.NET implementation is in beta. The idea is as soon as .NET 5 goes GA, or soon after that, we want the OpenTelemetry project will go GA. Again, that's a recommendation. I can't speak for it because it's an independent project with its own governance.
Yeah.
But I mean,
And GA means general availability,
yes.
which is basically released. That's
yes, it'll be a stable version which is released. The good thing is library authors can, start working on instrumenting their applications because they don't need to wait for the OpenTelemetry stuff. Oh my God. So my fire alarm is being tested.
Oh, good.
Oh.
Well, if it's a real fire, then I'll just
Unfortunately, John, I think we have to end now.
No. Okay. Well, that was a great demo. We'll share the links. Be safe. All right. Okay. I guess we'll end there then. Well, thanks a bunch, Sourabh. This was a fun show. Yeah, I told you suspense. I did promise suspense for the show. So the community links, I shared them earlier. I added in the link to the OpenTelemetry.net. So as he said, it's in GA, or it's in beta now. Will GA at or shortly after .NET 5 releases, and that's expected for .NET Conf. So .NET Conf is coming up, and that's .NET Conf is November 10th through 12th. And so a lot of cool stuff happening then, and including .NET 5. So very much looking forward to that. And I guess we'll wrap up there. For those that are watching on Twitch, we'll go raid somebody. And all right, I think that breaks some records for suspense in a show. So we'll let you know when we hear from Sourabh that he's okay. All right, thanks everybody.